We wouldn't have or adopt children if we weren't anxious to be their greatest friends.
Joan Crawford adopted 5 children throughout her life. Christina, the most well-known, twins Kathy and Cynthia, who defended their mother, and son Christopher Crawford. Though there were actually 2 Christophers, the first being traumatically reclaimed by his birth mother, the life of David Gary Deatherage, initially named Marcus Gary Kullberg, was marked by a series of events entangled in a complex adoption saga involving Hollywood icon Joan Crawford. He was born on June 3, 1941, to a 26-year-old woman named Rebecca Kullberg. Rebecca was married at the time, and David's birth was due to an affair with a local Sicilian liquor store owner. Rebecca decided in her 7th month of pregnancy to confess her affair to her husband. He became enraged upon learning about the affair, and they decided to place David up for adoption. The adoption was arranged by Joan Crawford's longtime baby broker Alice Howe, and the adoption has no connotations to the infamous Tennessee Children's Home, as some online rumors allege. However, the initial adoption of the first Christopher was short-lived, being reclaimed by his birth mother in November of 1941. After reading an interview with baby Christopher's birth date and birthplace, Rebecca started harassing Joan Crawford in MGM Studios at the time, demanding money and threatening bad press. Faced with this distressing situation, Joan Crawford made the difficult choice to return David to his birth mother, who did not truly want him, and put him up for adoption again. Joan wrote of the first Christopher in her 1962 autobiography, A Portrait of Joan, stating, quote, "The mother had given up the child when he was 10 days old, but she changed her mind when she read in the published interview where he was. I made the mistake of mentioning the birth date and birthplace. From that moment on, I had no peace. Day after day, she'd show up at my door. She sent threatening letters, demanding money. The situation assumed the aspects of a nightmare. My small son was entitled to a life. I could not allow his being used as the pawn of a tug-of-war. So I gave him back to the mother who really didn't want him, who promptly sold him. In short order, the adoption home stepped in, placing him where he couldn't possibly be found. There is one alleviating note. The people who adopted him knew of me. Every Christmas for 3 years, they sent a card, unsigned, but with his picture on it." In David's own autobiography, he briefly mentions his time with Joan Crawford, explaining that Joan Crawford and Alice had returned him to Rebecca's house. They carried him inside and handed him over to his birth mother, who proceeded to undress him. Alice became furious and demanded that Rebecca stop such an antics, all while Joan Crawford was crying. He said, quote, "Crawford and Howe left, leaving me behind. If they had known the hellish life I was condemned for the next year, there would have been horrors in their eyes." He went on to explain his birth mother's reasoning to threatening Joan. In the end, it came down to extortion. Rebecca never admitted it, but I think she and Kullberg, Rebecca's husband at the time, had always figured I was a meal ticket. I bet she really didn't count on Joan Crawford returning me, that she received some kind of compensation to keep her mouth shut. I was a valuable commodity during my days with Crawford. When I became returned merchandise, my value plummeted. My life was close to worthless. Rebecca's husband was concerned. I was a liability and a candidate for the next life. This was not the end of the chaos for David either. His sister told him that Rebecca's husband was both emotionally and physically abusive, refusing to allow the baby in sight, even keeping the child in closets when his father was home, and finally throwing him against a wall, rupturing the baby's hernia. At that point, Rebecca gave him up for adoption a final time. The heartache for Joan Crawford did not also get any easier. On December 20th, 1944, 3 years after the initial adoption and 5 days before Christmas Day, Rebecca forced her way into Joan Crawford's house after seeing articles detailing the adoption of Crawford's second son, Christopher. She was arrested and sent to psychiatric care. In David's autobiography, he mentions how he contacts Joan's secretary, Betty Barker, who tells him, quote, "I think you would have loved being Joan's son. All you had to do was be a good human being, and I know you are. I know you would have gotten along with her beautifully." He also quotes a Betty Barker letter. "When she lost you, all of us were afraid to mention your name to her for years, as it was a tender subject for her. She would have loved to have known what happened to you. She always used to say, I had 5 children, but I had returned one to his natural mother. She always seemed to feel that you were hers too. Also, through phone conversations with Crawford's twins, Kathy and Sydney, they tell him that Joan mentioned him frequently. Joan would also often mention she had 5 adopted children in interviews, referring to the first Christopher.
I think Hollywood now is the most depressing place in the entire world, and I am the most grateful human being in the whole world for what it has given me. It's given me my education, it's given me everything I've ever earned. The power to adopt 5 children, to raise them, to educate them. I will never be ungrateful for that.
Anna Toomey asks, have you ever returned for a visit to Stevens College?
Yes, 3 years ago. I received my diploma, and I said, you know, I left here at the age of 13. I adopted 5 children.